Sit comfortably. In this episode, we will visit ships abandoned several dozen meters deep, where you can find bathtubs, motorcycles, trucks. Before meeting microscopic organisms that are literally making a liner, the Titanic, disappear. But before venturing down 3,820 meters deep, let's start by taking a look at one of the largest shipwrecks in the Mediterranean. A gigantic ferry that sank in 1980 and now lies within swimming distance off the coast of Cyprus, the Zenobia. This iron and steel giant is sometimes called the Titanic of the Mediterranean. Because this sunken giant, although slightly smaller than its famous predecessor that sank on its maiden voyage, still has impressive dimensions. In fact, this wreck, with its 172 meters in length, is absolutely impossible to capture entirely on screen. But that's where the comparison ends, because when it sank, this ferry went down slowly. Everyone had time to be evacuated, and there were no casualties. And then, unlike the Titanic, which lying at a depth of 3,820 meters in the depths of the North Atlantic, can only be reached by submarine. The Zenobia, on the other hand, resting on its left side at a depth of 40 meters, is accessible to divers, and every year thousands of enthusiasts come to explore its interior. 35 years have passed since the ship sank. And even though the wreck is now mostly colonized by rich and varied marine life, in some places you could almost say that nothing has changed. Inside, the Zenobia still contains in its cargo holds everything it was carrying. Here, the overturned and ripped open truck beds reveal, like a hallucination, bones completely cleaned by the fish, which are all that's left of life. Sheep meat transported by the trucks, after a prolonged stay at a depth of 32 meters. There, in the fire of the cafeteria now lying on its side, you can blow bubbles sideways behind a slanted bar. And even though in 33 years the wood, like all organic elements, has disappeared, in the depths of the ship, where only the most experienced divers venture, it is possible to swim between the cars and the rusted trucks with strangely intact tires. In the Red Sea, the wreck of the legendary Sistol Gorm, which has been lying at the bottom of the sea for more than 80 years now, also seems to defy time. In the bowels of this ghostly wreck, which you can enter without knocking, you find a number of objects that have something magnetic about them. Here too, nothing or almost nothing seems to have changed. Everything here feels frozen in time, just like on the very first day. The tires look intact, and some sidecars seem like, with just a bit of dusting off, they're just waiting to start up again. But these thousands of tons of steel lying at the bottom of the sea, these anti-aircraft guns firmly fixed to the deck, like this locomotive resting 36 meters deep, are inevitably doomed to disappear. The lifespan of a shipwreck depends on where it sank and what it's made of. A trawler with a wooden hull sinking in the warm waters of the Indian Ocean will be quickly consumed by microorganisms. Marine worms, not heavy, and other crustaceans, but also broken down by the force of currents and waves, which together should take care of it in a few years. The Bassas da India Reef, located in the Mozambique Channel, is known for having sunk dozens of ships on its own since the 18th century. And yet, today, very often nothing remains of the wood of the ships that ran aground there. At most, all that's left are a few metal fragments, an anchor, as the only reminders of their shipwreck. In general, the fate of steel ships is often hardly any better. Those that sank in warm seas and close to the coast, where the currents are often the strongest, usually don't last much longer. The breakers and bad weather will tear them to shreds in just a few decades before scattering the remaining fragments to the four winds over the centuries. The long skeleton coast in Namibia is known for the many ships that have run aground there after falling victim to strong currents and fog that often hides the shore. On maps of this inhospitable region, you can see the locations of a large number of shipwrecks marked. But when you go to the supposed location of these wrecks, they are often already gone. having since been swallowed by the sand, carried away, or broken into pieces by the waves. And even though it's often more desirable, when you're a wreck, to end up protected from the dangers of the surface by dozens of meters of water, inevitably, these giants under the sea won't last long. Because as imposing as these steel monsters are, all of them are literally being eaten away. It's worth noting that all the world's oceans are home to a fauna of microscopic organisms, for whom metals like iron are the equivalent of delicious desserts for us. Scientists have discovered fungi and bacteria that develop an appetite for massive steel surfaces, which they slowly feed on. Because of, or thanks to, this microscopic biological activity, a wreck like the Sistel Gorm is only halfway through its lifespan, and by the end of this century or the next, it will eventually die a second time. After sinking over time, all these steel giants will be digested. Even a behemoth like the Titanic, which one might think is better off, is protected from the appetite of these bacteria by the depth at which the wreck lies and the biting cold at the bottom of the oceans, but it will not escape them. To an untrained eye, the wreck of the liner that sank in 1912 appears to be remarkably well preserved. But in reality, here too, even though it's barely 4 degrees, microorganisms are at work and are slowly and continuously digesting the wreck. These invisible gluttons feed by transforming about 150 tons of iron into a kind of extremely fragile rust mush. So the wreck should collapse within about 50 years and be almost completely decomposed and digested within 5 to 6 centuries. In fact, all these steel giants are affected depending on the depth, salinity, and temperature of the oceans where they sank, with their hulls being inexorably eaten away at a rate of 0.5 to 2 millimeters of thickness per decade. Fortunately, not all the seas and oceans of the world deal such a dire and rapid fate to those that end up on the bottom. It even happens, in rare cases, that these bacteria are not present, and we discover wrecks that seem completely undisturbed. Recently, off the coast of Bulgaria in the Black Sea, the wreck of a merchant ship was discovered almost completely intact, even though it was made of wood and dated back to ancient times. In fact, the reason this vessel is so well preserved, even after spending 2,400 years underwater at nearly 2 kilometers deep, is because the sea where it sank has some remarkable properties. In the Black Sea, beyond 180 meters deep, the water becomes anoxic, meaning it is extremely low in oxygen. In these deep, dark waters, there are few or no organisms capable of decomposing organic matter. And under these conditions, wood, leather, ropes, and even fabrics can be preserved, making the Black Sea a little paradise for wreck hunters. And above all, one of the largest submerged museums in human history, in which dozens and dozens of wrecks have been identified, dating from the Renaissance, the Byzantine Empire, and for the oldest ones, even going back to antiquity. Much further north, in the Baltic Sea, we also find very unique conditions that have allowed some ships to be preserved for centuries. For example, a ship was recently found perfectly preserved in a muddy channel at the exit of the port of Stockholm. The Vasa, a Swedish warship that sank during its maiden voyage in 1628. And its hull was so well preserved that they even raised it before gradually rebuilding it to display it in a museum. Today, after spending 3 centuries underwater, this ship has even become the most visited boat in the world. Every year in Sweden, nearly 1 million people come to see it. In fact, if the Vasa, like that other legendary ship, the Mars, which was sunk during a naval battle nearly 500 years ago, are so well preserved after spending centuries at the bottom of the Baltic Sea, it's because the Baltic Sea lacks the mollusks that feed on wood. But also, and paradoxically, because they sank in toxic and polluted environments, such as the Stockholm Channel, whose conditions are harsh for many cellulose-loving microorganisms. This other wooden wreck, also discovered resting in the deep waters of the Baltic Sea for more than 5 centuries, seems to be better preserved than many of the steel monsters we visited, which have only spent a tenth of that time at the bottom of the Red Sea or the Mediterranean. And if you feel like, in this episode, you've had your fill of wrecks, enough to discuss the steel-eating bacterium, just think of all those mysteries still lurking at the bottom of the seas, those ships waiting to be found, whether in good condition or decomposed, and which often have no value other than their history and the stories told by the objects they contain, which can sometimes be found in large quantities. Like this impressive field of amphorae discovered by a team from the oceanographic vessel Nautilus in the Aegean Sea. Because the shipwrecks that accidentally sank to the bottom show us the past as it really was. These ships, with few exceptions, did not choose the moment when they would sink. And when archaeologists use submarines to reach deep wrecks, they know for sure that no human has been here before them. Unlike tombs or temples located on land, which may have been visited and desecrated over their long history, shipwrecks are, at the moment of their discovery, time capsules, preserving a snapshot of the past. Around a bend in a submerged corridor, you enter the captain's cabin, now cheerfully occupied by fish. And in the center of this room, 20 meters underwater, there is a helm covered in algae. Maybe it's pointing you toward Heraklion, whose mythical name doesn't belong to a shipwreck, but to a city swallowed by an earthquake and rediscovered under 8 meters of seawater, nearly 7 kilometers from the Egyptian coast. Sometimes, at the bottom of the sea, there are toilets and bathtubs filled to the brim with mysteries and stories to tell.